You really thought you belonged here? The words sliced through the glittering ballroom with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting hands. A string quartet continued playing for another heartbeat before the uneasy silence swallowed even the music. Beneath the towering chandeliers of the Grand Regent Hotel in Manhattan, where business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists had gathered for the annual Legacy Foundation Gala, hundreds of eyes shifted toward a woman standing quietly near the entrance. Naomi Brooks, dressed in a simple navy evening dress without flashy jewelry or an entourage, looked completely out of place only if someone judged success by appearances alone. Across from her stood Olivia Sinclair, 24 years old, wrapped in designer confidence and surrounded by friends who laughed before anything funny had even happened. Olivia glanced down at a faint splash of sparkling water that had landed on the edge of her expensive gown after she turned too quickly through the crowded reception area. Without asking a single question or waiting for an explanation, she stepped forward and struck Naomi across the face with a sharp, impulsive motion that echoed far louder in memory than in sound. The ballroom seemed to inhale all at once. A waiter nearly dropped a silver tray. A violinist lowered her bow. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. Naomi slowly turned her head back, her expression remarkably steady, one hand lightly touching her cheek for only a second before letting it fall naturally to her side. There was no anger in her eyes, only quiet disappointment, as though this moment felt painfully familiar. Then came something even colder than the silence. Richard Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Holdings, looked at his daughter with amusement instead of concern. Victoria Sinclair covered a smile behind her champagne glass before letting out a soft laugh that spread through the small circle surrounding them. A few guests joined in awkwardly, unsure whether they were witnessing an unfortunate misunderstanding or simply following the lead of one of America's wealthiest families. Olivia folded her arms proudly. "Maybe next time you'll watch where you're standing," she said with a smirk that expected applause instead of accountability. Naomi didn't answer. She bent calmly, picked up the invitation badge that had slipped onto the polished marble floor, brushed away a nearly invisible speck of dust, and held it gently between her fingers. Her breathing never changed. Her shoulders never tensed. She looked around the magnificent ballroom as if memorizing every face, every whispered reaction, every person who had chosen comfort over courage. Near the registration desk, a young event coordinator frowned as she glanced toward a digital guest list on her tablet. Something about the name Naomi Brooks caught her attention. She hesitated, studying the screen again before looking back toward the woman standing alone beneath the golden lights. Across the room, several guests quietly reached for their phones but lowered them again, sensing that recording the moment somehow felt smaller than witnessing it. The tension thickened with every passing second. Olivia tilted her head, convinced silence meant defeat. Richard casually adjusted his tuxedo cuff links, completely certain the evening still belonged to his family. None of them realized that the woman they had just humiliated had not lost her composure. She had simply begun paying attention, and before this gala reached its final toast, every laugh echoing through that ballroom would carry a price no one in the Sinclair family had imagined possible. Naomi Brooks slipped the invitation badge back into her evening clutch as though nothing unusual had happened, and somehow that quiet gesture unsettled the room more than any angry response could have. Her cheeks still carried the warmth of Olivia Sinclair's impulsive action, but her face revealed nothing except calm patience. She neither demanded an apology nor asked security to intervene. Instead, she looked toward the ballroom stage where the evening's charitable presentations would begin in less than 30 minutes. Around her, conversations slowly restarted, although none of them sounded natural anymore. Every whisper carried curiosity. Every glance lingered a little too long. Olivia laughed softly with her friends, convinced the uncomfortable moment had already passed. Richard Sinclair accepted another glass of sparkling water from a server and continued greeting influential executives as if nothing important had happened. Victoria Sinclair complimented another guest's jewelry while casually remarking that some people simply wandered into places where they clearly did not belong. Their confidence spread through the crowd like permission. A few guests nodded politely. Others looked away, unwilling to challenge one of the city's most powerful business families. Naomi quietly walked toward a display of photographs celebrating the foundation's 25th anniversary. She stopped in front of an image showing children receiving scholarships funded by corporate donors. Her reflection appeared faintly in the polished glass covering the photograph. For just a moment, she studied her own eyes. They carried the same steady determination that had followed her through every boardroom, every difficult negotiation, and every moment someone had underestimated her before eventually learning the truth. A young hospitality coordinator named Emily Carter stood near the registration table pretending to organize guest folders while secretly opening the digital attendance list again. The name Naomi Brooks remained highlighted with a discreet executive designation that required additional clearance. Emily frowned. She refreshed the system once, then twice. The designation did not disappear. Before she could say anything, her event manager stepped beside her and quietly closed the tablet. "Focus on the schedule," he whispered. "The Sinclair family are our headline sponsors tonight." Emily hesitated. Something about the elegant woman standing alone near the photographs did not match the story everyone else seemed eager to believe. Across the ballroom, Olivia noticed Naomi had not left. Her smile slowly disappeared. "She is still here," she muttered, sounding more irritated than surprised. One of her friends shrugged. "Maybe she likes the attention." Olivia laughed again, louder this time, making sure Naomi could hear. People always pretend confidence until someone reminds them where they belong. Richard overheard the comment and gave an approving smile. "Do not waste another thought on her," he said. "By tomorrow, nobody will remember this little incident." Naomi heard every word. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her dress and checked the time on her watch. 7:23 in the evening. Exactly according to schedule. Her phone vibrated once inside her clutch. She glanced at the screen without changing her expression. A single message from her executive assistant appeared. "Everything is ready whenever you are." Naomi locked the screen without replying. Not yet. She believed timing often carried more power than volume. Nearby, an elderly guest quietly approached another businessman and asked, "Do you know that woman?" The man studied Naomi for several seconds before slowly shaking his head. "No," he admitted, "but I have a feeling someone important does." Across the ballroom, Emily looked once more toward Naomi, then toward the massive presentation screen being prepared behind the stage. An uneasy feeling settled over her. Whatever was about to happen next, she knew one thing with complete certainty. The quietest person in the room was somehow the only one who did not look surprised by how the night was unfolding. Olivia Sinclair watched Naomi Brooks from across the ballroom with growing irritation instead of satisfaction. The silence she expected to feel like victory had become something else entirely. Every minute Naomi remained inside the Grand Regent Hotel seemed to challenge the version of events Olivia had already created in her own mind. "Why is she still here?" Olivia asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Richard Sinclair glanced over without concern. "Because she hopes someone will notice her," he answered confidently. "Eventually security will handle it if she refuses to leave." Victoria Sinclair smiled politely at another donor before adding, "Some people mistake an invitation for belonging." Their words drifted through the reception area, finding willing ears among those eager to agree with wealth and influence. A few guests nodded without knowing anything about Naomi except what they had just been told. Others remained silent, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the family that had financed much of the evening's charitable event. Near the stage, Emily Carter could no longer ignore the uneasiness growing inside her. She quietly reopened the event management system on a second tablet reserved for executive coordinators. Naomi Brooks's profile appeared once again, accompanied by restricted notes that Emily was not authorized to access. Before she could read further, the screen automatically locked. She looked toward the ballroom entrance where the legal representatives for several sponsoring corporations had begun arriving. One of them, a middle-aged attorney named Daniel Foster, slowed his pace the moment he noticed Naomi standing alone beside the scholarship display. His expression changed instantly. He looked from Naomi to the Sinclair family and then back again, as though trying to understand how two completely different worlds had somehow collided inside the same room. Daniel started walking toward Richard Sinclair, but was intercepted by another executive eager to discuss investment opportunities. The brief interruption lasted only seconds, Yet it was enough for the opportunity to disappear, as Richard was soon surrounded by photographers and business associates requesting pictures before the evening program began. Naomi remained exactly where she was. She quietly accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, thanked him with a warm smile, and continued observing the room. Her calm unsettled people more than any confrontation could have. An elderly donor whispered to his wife, "She has not tried to defend herself once." His wife answered softly, "Sometimes the strongest people do not need to." Across the ballroom, Olivia noticed several guests glancing toward Naomi instead of herself. The shift in attention irritated her. She crossed the room with deliberate confidence until she stood only a few feet away. "I thought you would have left by now," she said. Naomi met her eyes with quiet composure. "I am exactly where I planned to be this evening," she replied. There was no sarcasm in her voice, only certainty. Olivia laughed dismissively. "You really do not know when to quit." Naomi simply smiled, offering no further explanation. That answer frustrated Olivia far more than an argument would have. Behind them, Daniel Foster finally reached Emily Carter near the registration desk. Keeping his voice low, he asked, "Has anyone spoken with Ms. Brooks since she arrived?" Emily shook her head. "Everyone assumes she should not be here." Daniel looked toward the Sinclair family, concern replacing confusion. "Someone needs to stop this before the program begins," he murmured. Emily asked why, but Daniel hesitated. He understood the confidential nature of the information he carried. Still, as he watched Richard Sinclair greeting reporters with complete confidence, while Olivia continued mocking the quiet woman standing only a few yards away, he realized the evening was moving toward a disaster that no public relations team would be able to repair. For the first time since arriving, he reached into his jacket, removed his phone, and prepared to make a call that could change everything before the first speaker ever stepped onto the stage. Daniel Foster stepped away from the growing crowd and pressed a single contact on his phone, keeping his voice measured despite the urgency rising inside him. "I need confirmation," he said quietly. "Has Ms. Naomi Brooks arrived?" The answer came almost immediately. "She checked in 18 minutes ago. She is scheduled to join the chairman on stage before the partnership announcement." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second. "Then we have a serious problem." Emily Carter watched him lower the phone and saw genuine concern replace every trace of professional composure. "Who is she?" Emily asked. Daniel looked toward Naomi, who still stood alone near the scholarship display, studying the photographs as though the ballroom noise belonged to another world. "She is the reason half the executives in this room accepted tonight's invitation," he answered carefully. "If I am right, this evening is about to change in ways nobody here expects." Emily's heartbeat quickened. "Should we tell Mr. Sinclair?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. Immediately, they crossed the ballroom together, weaving through clusters of investors, nonprofit directors, and reporters preparing for the evening program. Before they reached Richard Sinclair, a master of ceremonies stopped him to review the presentation schedule one final time. Another sponsor requested a photograph. A television producer asked for a brief interview before the live broadcast began. Every passing minute built another layer of delay. Emily finally stepped forward. "Mr. Sinclair, there is something important you need to hear." Richard barely looked at her. Later, he replied with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "The program starts soon." Daniel tried again. "It concerns one of tonight's guests." Richard adjusted his cuff links without slowing his conversation with a state senator standing beside him. "If it is about that woman, security can handle it." Daniel's expression hardened. "I do not believe security is the answer." Richard finally turned, visibly annoyed. "Then what is?" Before Daniel could answer, Olivia approached carrying effortless confidence. "Are we still talking about her?" she asked with a laugh. "She is still wandering around pretending she belongs here." Victoria joined them moments later, her voice smooth enough to disguise the arrogance underneath. "Some people refuse to recognize when an evening is not meant for them." Emily looked from one family member to another, realizing none of them had the slightest interest in understanding the situation before judging it. Daniel took one final step forward. "I strongly recommend that someone speak with Ms. Brooks before tonight's announcement begins." Richard gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You are worried about offending one guest." Daniel answered carefully. "I am worried about offending the wrong guest." The words lingered for a moment, but Richard simply shook his head. There is no guest more important than the sponsors who built this foundation. Olivia smiled proudly, believing the conversation was finished. Across the ballroom, Naomi quietly greeted an elderly board member who had just arrived through a private entrance. They exchanged a warm handshake and only a few polite words before the gentleman continued toward the backstage area. Emily noticed the exchange immediately. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Daniel had seen it too. The board member was Harold Bennett, chairman of one of the nation's largest investment groups, a man known for rarely leaving private meetings to greet anyone personally. Yet he had paused for Naomi without hesitation. Daniel no longer felt uncertainty. He felt inevitability. He looked toward the enormous presentation screen above the stage where technicians were making their final adjustments. The countdown clock showed less than 20 minutes until the partnership ceremony. Around the ballroom, guests continued laughing, networking, and celebrating, completely unaware that the evening had already reached the point where one simple conversation could have prevented everything that was about to unfold. The ballroom lights softened as the evening program drew closer, but the atmosphere around Naomi Brooks grew heavier with every passing minute. Conversations paused whenever she walked by, then resumed in quieter voices after she moved on. It was not because she had caused another disturbance. It was because her composure had become impossible to ignore. Olivia Sinclair mistook that silence for weakness. She stepped directly into Naomi's path again, this time with several friends standing behind her, eager spectators to what they assumed would be another easy victory. "You are still here," Olivia said with a smile that carried more pride than kindness. "I guess embarrassment does not bother everyone." Naomi met her gaze with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. Embarrassment usually belongs to the person creating the scene, not the person standing through it. Several nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances. Olivia's smile faded for only a second before she reached toward the elegant invitation badge resting inside Naomi's hand. "You do not need this anymore," she said, pulling the badge away before anyone could react. She looked at it briefly, then carelessly folded it in half and dropped it onto a nearby cocktail table. The room became painfully quiet. Again, Richard Sinclair watched the exchange without concern. Instead of correcting his daughter, he casually remarked, "Some invitations are printed by mistake." Victoria nodded in agreement. "The evening will move much more smoothly once unnecessary distractions leave." Naomi slowly picked up the folded badge, smoothing its edges with remarkable care. Her fingers lingered over the small gold lettering, as though preserving something far more valuable than laminated paper. For a brief moment, the ballroom disappeared from her thoughts. She remembered another evening nearly 20 years earlier in Chicago. She had been 23 years old, wearing her only business suit, arriving at a reception after securing her first major investment meeting. A receptionist had looked at her, then at the guest list, and quietly suggested she wait outside because the event was for executives. She had stood in the hallway for almost an hour before one of the firm's partners personally came looking for her, shocked that the future founder of his newest investment had been left outside simply because she did not match someone's expectations. Naomi had never forgotten that lesson. Success could buy buildings, companies, and influence, but it could never erase assumptions from people determined to make them. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived. She looked back at Olivia, Richard, and Victoria without resentment. "I hope this evening becomes everything you expect it to be," she said softly. Richard smiled confidently. "It already has." Across the ballroom, Daniel Foster closed his eyes in frustration. Emily Carter whispered, "They still do not understand." Daniel answered quietly, "No. They think this is still about pride." His phone vibrated. A message appeared from corporate legal counsel confirming that all partnership documents were prepared for signature immediately following the keynote presentation. Daniel read the message twice before locking the screen. He knew the agreement represented $750 million in future investments, thousands of jobs, and years of planning. He also knew every page depended upon one person's approval. Naomi's phone vibrated almost simultaneously. She glanced down at a single notification from her executive assistant. "Board members are assembled. Authorization is standing by." Naomi slipped the phone back into her clutch without replying. She did not need to rush. Every decision had its proper moment. On the stage, Technicians completed the final microphone tests while the large presentation screen illuminated the ballroom with soft blue light. Guests began moving toward their assigned tables as the master of ceremonies prepared to welcome everyone. Richard Sinclair straightened his tuxedo jacket with absolute confidence, convinced the most important moment of his career was only minutes away. Standing only a short distance from him, Naomi quietly took her place near the front of the ballroom. For everyone else, the ceremony was about to begin. For her, it had already reached the point where silence had done all the work words never could. As guests settled into their seats beneath the crystal chandeliers, the ballroom transformed from a reception into a stage where reputations, fortunes, and carefully crafted public images would soon stand under the brightest lights. Naomi Brooks remained standing near the aisle for one final moment before quietly stepping into the hallway outside the ballroom. The noise behind the closed doors softened instantly. She reached into her clutch, removed her phone, and placed a single call. Her executive assistant answered before the first ring had fully ended. "Good evening, Ms. Brooks." Naomi looked through the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, where thousands of city lights stretched into the distance. "Activate board protocol," she said calmly. There was no anger in her voice, no trace of revenge, only the steady confidence of someone making a necessary business decision. "Understood," her assistant replied immediately. "Board members are already connected. Legal counsel is present. Corporate communications is standing by. Investor relations has been placed on alert. Would you like us to proceed to executive authorization?" Naomi glanced once toward the ballroom doors. "Proceed with preparation. No announcements until I give final approval." "Confirmed," came the reply. "Every document will remain pending your instruction." The call ended. Naomi slipped the phone back into her clutch as though she had simply confirmed a dinner reservation instead of setting an entire corporate process into motion. Inside the ballroom, invisible wheels had already begun turning. Attorneys quietly reviewed digital agreements. Compliance officers reopened partnership files. Senior executives received discreet notifications asking them to remain available. Members of the board suspended unrelated meetings and joined a secure conference line without asking unnecessary questions. They had learned over many years that Naomi never activated executive protocol without a reason. Back inside the ballroom, Richard Sinclair accepted congratulations from investors who believed the evening would conclude with one of the largest partnership announcements of the year. $750 million, one executive said with admiration. "Congratulations in advance." Richard smiled confidently. "We have been preparing for this moment for nearly 18 months. Olivia listened proudly beside him. "See," she whispered to one of her friends. "Nothing happened. People always make drama out of nothing." Her friend nodded, although she noticed several unfamiliar executives entering through a side entrance with unusually serious expressions. Near the registration desk, Emily Carter watched her email inbox fill with calendar updates marked executive priority. Daniel Foster received the same notifications. He read each one carefully before looking toward the hallway where Naomi had disappeared only moments earlier. "It has started," he whispered. Emily looked confused. "What has?" Daniel answered quietly. "The part nobody in this room can stop anymore." Naomi returned to the ballroom exactly as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone to their seats. She moved with the same measured pace she had maintained all evening, attracting curious glances without seeking anyone's attention. Harold Bennett rose briefly from the front table as she approached. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. Naomi gave a small nod. "Everything is becoming clear." Harold studied her expression for a moment before returning to his seat without another question. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers with her for more than a decade. He recognized that look. It appeared only when every decision had already been made. Across the room, Olivia noticed Harold greeting Naomi with obvious respect. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before disappearing beneath another confident smile. She convinced herself it meant nothing. Richard remained focused on the presentation schedule displayed on the enormous screen above the stage, unaware that the partnership documents he expected to sign were no longer moving toward completion, but toward reconsideration. The countdown clock reached 5 minutes before the keynote presentation. Around the ballroom, guests applauded as the opening remarks began. They believed they were about to witness the celebration of a historic business alliance. Only a handful of people understood that the most important decision of the evening had already been made quietly, with one calm phone call that nobody, except Naomi, had truly noticed. The master of ceremonies stepped to the center of the stage as the ballroom lights dimmed, and a polished highlight reel celebrating the Legacy Foundation filled the massive screen. Warm applause echoed across the room, while servers quietly cleared the final dinner plates. Richard Sinclair leaned back with complete confidence, exchanging satisfied smiles with investors seated at his table. Olivia crossed one leg over the other, convinced the uncomfortable encounter from earlier had already disappeared into the background of an otherwise perfect evening. Then the master of ceremonies smiled toward the audience and adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight as we celebrate generosity, innovation, and partnerships that shape the future. Before we recognize our principal investment initiative, it is my privilege to welcome the visionary leader whose organization made tonight's historic commitment possible. Please join me in welcoming the Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Capital, Ms. Naomi Brooks. 4. 1 impossible second, nothing moved. Richard's smile froze. Victoria lowered her glass without taking another sip. Olivia stared toward the stage, waiting for someone else to stand. Nobody did. Naomi Brooks rose quietly from her chair near the front of the ballroom. She smoothed the sleeve of her navy dress, thanked Harold Bennett with a gentle nod, and walked toward the stage with calm, measured steps. Every footstep seemed to erase another assumption that had filled the room only minutes before. The enormous screen behind her shifted from the foundation logo to a simple executive profile. Naomi Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Brooks Capital, lead strategic investment partner. The ballroom fell into complete silence. Emily Carter covered her mouth in disbelief. Daniel Foster slowly released the breath he had been holding for nearly an hour. Around the room, guests exchanged stunned glances as scattered whispers spread faster than applause ever could. Richard Sinclair stood halfway from his chair before stopping, unable to reconcile the woman his family had dismissed with the executive now standing beneath the brightest lights in the ballroom. Olivia's face lost its confidence all at once. She looked from the screen to Naomi and back again, searching for some explanation that would restore the version of reality she had believed only moments earlier. Naomi reached the podium and allowed the silence to remain for another heartbeat. She did not rush to fill it. She understood that truth often arrived most powerfully after people had already heard it themselves. She looked across the audience, meeting familiar faces one by one before her eyes finally settled on the Sinclair family. Her expression remained steady, neither triumphant nor bitter. "Good evening," she began. "I have attended hundreds of business events throughout my career. I have negotiated contracts worth billions of dollars, worked alongside extraordinary leaders, and learned that character reveals itself most clearly when people believe there are no consequences." The room remained perfectly still. Naomi continued, her voice calm enough that every word carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "Earlier this evening, I was judged before anyone asked my name. I was treated according to assumptions rather than facts. What happened was not important because of who I am. It was important because the same treatment would have been wrong if I had been anyone else." Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his confidence replaced by visible disbelief. Olivia could no longer meet Naomi's eyes. Victoria's hands tightened around the stem of her glass. Naomi paused briefly before delivering the words that changed the atmosphere forever. "You believed you were humiliating a stranger. Instead, you chose to demonstrate your values in front of the very person whose partnership you hoped to earn. Tonight was never a test of status. It was a test of character. And every important decision has already been made." The silence that followed Naomi Brooks's final sentence carried more weight than applause ever could. No one reached for a glass. No one whispered. Even the photographers standing along the ballroom walls lowered their cameras, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a ceremonial partnership announcement. Naomi remained at the podium with the same quiet confidence that had defined her throughout the evening. She touched the presentation monitor once, and the large screen behind her changed to a single slide displaying the title Executive Board Resolution. Every member of the audience looked up at once. 1 hour ago, Naomi said evenly, Brooks Capital intended to finalize a $750 million strategic partnership with Sinclair Holdings. Our board completed every financial review, every legal requirement, and every operational assessment. On paper, the opportunity made perfect business sense. Richard Sinclair slowly stood from his chair. Naomi, if there has been a misunderstanding, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak privately. Naomi acknowledged him with a respectful nod, but did not step away from the microphone. This is not a misunderstanding, Mr. Sinclair. It is an observation. She paused briefly before continuing. Our company evaluates financial performance very carefully. We also evaluate leadership, judgment, and organizational culture. Tonight provided information that could never appear inside a balance sheet. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Naomi glanced toward the front row where several members of Brooks Capital's executive leadership had quietly taken their seats during the presentation. Harold Bennett gave a single confirming nod. Naomi continued. Effective immediately, the board of directors has unanimously authorized the withdrawal of our proposed investment and the cancellation of all negotiations concerning this partnership. A quiet wave of disbelief moved across the room. Several executives instinctively looked toward Richard Sinclair, waiting for him to object, but he remained frozen beside his chair. Victoria Sinclair's expression shifted from confidence to shock. Olivia stared at the enormous screen where the words partnership withdrawn appeared beneath the board resolution. Naomi's executive assistant, seated near the side of the ballroom, received the final authorization and calmly pressed one confirmation button on her tablet. Within seconds, legal notifications, investor updates, and corporate communications were transmitted simultaneously. There was no dramatic announcement, no raised voices, only the efficient precision of a decision already completed. Daniel Foster quietly closed the leather portfolio containing the unsigned agreement. 18 months of preparation ended with one smooth motion. Emily Carter watched the executives around her exchange stunned expressions. One investor whispered, "They walked away from $750 million because of leadership conduct." Another answered softly, "No. They walked away because leadership conduct predicts every future decision." Richard finally found his voice. "We can correct this," he said, sounding less certain than anyone in the room had ever heard him. "Please allow us to explain." Naomi looked directly at him. "I believe your explanation would be sincere. I also believe that the most important decisions people make are often the ones they never expected anyone to notice." She allowed another moment of silence before adding, "Business partnerships require trust long before they require signatures. Tonight, trust was the only document that could not be rewritten." Olivia lowered her eyes for the first time since the evening began. The confidence that had surrounded her only an hour earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by the unmistakable realization that a few careless moments had changed the future her family believed was already secured. Around the ballroom, guests did not celebrate. They did not cheer. Instead, they sat quietly, watching a lesson unfold that no keynote speaker could have delivered more clearly. The agreement had not been lost because of one financial mistake. It had been lost because character had revealed itself before the contract was ever signed. Naomi Brooks stepped away from the podium without waiting for applause because none was necessary. The truth had already settled across the ballroom with a permanence no speech could improve. Harold Bennett rose first, followed by the members of the Brooks Capital leadership team. One after another, they quietly joined Naomi near the front of the stage, not to celebrate a victory, but to stand beside the values they had spent decades building together. The master of ceremonies remained silent, understanding that no prepared remarks belonged after what everyone had just witnessed. Richard Sinclair slowly approached the stage, his confident stride replaced by careful, uncertain steps. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, making no effort to use the microphone, "I owe you an apology." Naomi turned toward him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the evening. "I appreciate your willingness to say that," she replied. "I hope it is not only because of the partnership." Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time that evening, he did not have an immediate answer. Olivia remained beside her mother, unable to look toward the stage. The confidence that had once surrounded her had been replaced by uncomfortable reflection. Victoria placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, but neither of them spoke. The room had become a place where silence finally encouraged honesty instead of assumption. Emily Carter watched from the registration area, realizing she would remember this evening for the rest of her career. Daniel Foster quietly gathered the unsigned contracts and placed them back inside his briefcase. They were no longer business documents. They had become reminders that the strongest agreements begin long before signatures appear on paper. Naomi accepted a handshake from Harold Bennett before making her way toward the ballroom exit. Guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without anyone asking them to do so. Several people nodded respectfully as she passed. Others simply watched in thoughtful silence. Nobody saw a woman who needed recognition anymore. They saw someone whose dignity had remained unchanged whether people recognized her or not. Near the entrance, Emily caught up with Naomi. "Ms. Brooks," she said softly, "I wanted to tell you that I should have spoken sooner." Naomi offered her a warm smile. "You were paying attention," she answered. "Never stop doing that." Organizations become stronger when people have the courage to notice what others ignore. Emily nodded, carrying those words with visible gratitude. Outside the hotel, the cool Manhattan evening welcomed Naomi with a quiet breeze flowing between the city lights. Her driver opened the car door, but she paused for one final glance back at the illuminated ballroom windows. Inside, conversations had resumed, although they sounded very different from those at the beginning of the night. They were no longer centered on wealth, influence, or appearances. They were centered on judgment, responsibility, and respect. Naomi entered the car, and as it pulled away from the Grand Regent Hotel, the skyline reflected across the windows like countless opportunities waiting beyond a single evening. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded revenge. She had simply allowed people to reveal themselves before making a decision that aligned with her principles. The canceled partnership would make headlines by morning, but the true lesson would never appear in any financial report. It would live in every person who had witnessed how quickly assumptions could destroy trust and how quietly integrity could redefine power. Long after the ballroom lights dimmed and the final guests returned home, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Respect is never earned by titles, wealth, or recognition. It begins the moment we choose to treat every person with dignity before we know who they are.